While we know that the Iranian threat actors are very sophisticated, they're looking for the fastest way to execute their mission, which is looking at the low-hanging fruit, what's exposed, and how they can execute havoc and chaos in the United States based on retribution for the actions that are taken in Iran. Iranian-linked threat actors are targeting U.S.-based companies and U.S.-based critical infrastructure. These agencies, including FBI, NSA, Department of Energy, are all warning critical infrastructure about this. The advisory that it's already happening, even to the point that there's Iranian threat actors who defaced some interfaces to U.S. critical infrastructure, PLCs. They pulled down files that hold configuration data. This is more of a warning of make sure they're not already in your infrastructure and start blocking this now, because this is actually happening. More so than a warning of this could happen, this is theoretical. A lot of these PLCs, think about things like water systems or dams or power grids. These internal workings and internal circuitry were all meant to be local to those infrastructures. They were never meant to be exposed to the internet. And in fact, many times, if you look at companies that have manufacturing or PLCs or OT environments, these things are all air-gapped, right? They're not connected to the internet. And many of them won't even allow you to do updates. You have to do out-of-band updates, meaning a local file, local USB stick has to be plugged up to get updates into these systems, because for one, they were never meant to be connected to the internet. So in structures like routers and other things to get that data out to the internet were never built in, because they were always thought to be used locally. However, as people have gone out with COVID and people at remote work and other things, many organizations have exposed these things to the internet so that they can manage them and administer them remotely. Things like default passwords, things like no passwords required, things like administrative access and no MFA available, weren't built into these systems. A lot of these systems are 20 or 30 years old, right? They're power systems or water systems that were put in place back in the late 1990s or maybe early 2000s. That's part of our problem here in the U.S. is a lot of times these critical infrastructures are running on older systems that were never modernized and never secured for the public internet and the threats that we face today. Now, secondly, the Iranian threat actors, I think this is low-hanging fruit. I mean, these are things that for us at SecurityScorecard, we can expose and we can look from an external attack surface standpoint and give information back to these critical infrastructure vendors and these critical infrastructure providers that they have things exposed on the internet. But just consider how many there are. I think this is one of the problems with the scale of this situation. You've got a lot of these that are townships or very small systems that are still considered critical infrastructure. They don't have the time or resources to update or fix some of these issues. So the Iranian threat actors just go out and find these things by scanning the public internet, and then they can easily compromise them. While we know that the Iranian threat actors are very sophisticated, they're looking for the fastest way to execute their mission, which is looking at the low-hanging fruit, what's exposed, and how they can execute havoc and chaos in the United States based on retribution for the actions that are taken in Iran. Imagine that you've got an interface that an operator comes up to that has an option to close a valve or open a valve, which is what these PLC systems mainly control, things like solenoids, valves, and other electronic circuitry to manage the flow of whatever it is they're managing. Water could be electricity, could be pharmaceuticals, right? Or other retail type OT lines. Imagine they come up and there's an interface to turn a valve on or off, but threat actors have downloaded that interface and switched it. So when you actually say you're going to turn off a valve, you're turning on a valve, or instead of closing a dam, you're opening a dam. Those are the types of real world impact. The project files are giving the threat actors understanding of how the whole system works, so they understand where they can execute the most havoc or the most damage. As a defender, what you have to do from a trust standpoint is, one, we have to be able to respond to these incidents. We have to validate that somebody's been in our systems. So that's looking and thinking about loggings and audit logs and all those things. We as defenders really have to take a hard look at what's going on from an audit perspective, these systems, validating and looking at our attack surface ourselves and seeing what has been vulnerable. If it was vulnerable, was somebody exploiting it and taking advantage of it, and then taking the proper steps from there. But as defenders, when that trust chain is broken, you have to go back to the old mantra of trust but verify and start scrutinizing everything and being very critical of all the functionality of these PLC systems. As Security Scorecard exposes some of this external attack surface and external problems, we can use AI to dive deeper into those exposures and see what's really critical to us. A vulnerability is a vulnerability, but really, if we're looking at a vulnerability from the standpoint of what can affect our risk, is it exploitable? Are there exploits in the wild? Do we see threat actors actually taking advantage of this? AI can use all of those criteria to help us as defenders understand where we need to prioritize and where we need to focus. We can even use AI to help with some of the remediation. If we build AI into some of our remediation processes and playbooks, the scale may be so massive for a lot of companies and a lot of public systems, but if we use AI to expose, prioritize, and then remediate, we can get faster to solving the problem than just a lot of noise. And we got a million different vulnerabilities or alerts. Which ones do we go attack? If we can use AI to help us in that whole process, we can stop these vulnerabilities or stop these exposures before they are exploited by threat actors. It can't be a bolt-on. It can't be something that you think of as an afterthought. It really has to be built into playbooks and how we as defenders go about building out our defense systems across the board. We also can use AI to probe our own defenses and come back and tell us, you're good in this spot, but here you've got gaps, so we can fix some of those gaps as well. So with the news of Claude Mythos, there's still a lot of unknowns around what the possibilities are here. The report is it found a vulnerability in OpenBSD, I think that's been there for 27 years. That's pretty concerning, right? Because what it means is nobody else found that vulnerability in 27 years, and it's a real vulnerability. What else are we missing? You can easily get into this rabbit hole of, oh no, everything's vulnerable and we'll never be able to fix it. I think we have to be very calm and thoughtful in how we approach this and how we think about defending going forward. Again, as I've mentioned several times, defense in depth is always a good process for us as defenders to think about, because there's always going to be gaps. But if you can put controls or process in place around those gaps to help protect you, even if a gap is realized and an exploit is done at one layer, you've got another layer to reduce the blast radius and help recover appropriately. This is a really strong step for us as cyber defenders to start thinking about the idea of resiliency even more. And cyber resiliency has come up as a topic a lot more out in the industry, but we have to start putting our money where our mouth is and start executing and actioning on that. What that means is looking at when and if a breach happens, how do we defend against the blast radius of that breach? Well, this should prove out the attacks and the exploits are going to continue coming. They're even going to come faster. And you probably are looking at some type of breach or compromise in the near future. However, that could have happened even before Mythos. So putting in the same tried and true principles like defense in depth, compensating controls, all those sorts of things for us as defenders becomes even more top of mind than what it's been in the past. I'm Steve Cobb, and this is Security Scorecard's weekly brief, the Adversary Insights Edition, where we break down the biggest stories in cybersecurity, threat intelligence, and how we defend critical infrastructure in today's interconnected digital world.